what I think we need to take away from this is we have a choice. We have a choice that God is always the God of the second chance. He's always after us. He's always trying to get our attention, and we just have to pay attention. And when we do, the Bible is also quick to tell us that if we return to God's ways, we get it right, that the blessings of that Father will be passed down to the 1,000th generation. So if we commit sexual sins and we don't do anything about it, we stay distracted, that can be passed down to the second, third, and fourth generation. If we get it right, if we return to God, we allow God to be the God of the second chance, the blessings of that might exist for 1,000 generations.
Welcome to the Faithful and True podcast. Today we'd like to feature the third in a series about the God of second chances. These are legacy podcasts back from our days with the Faithful and True version that was called Men of Valor program, featuring our host, Dr. Mark Laaser. In this third and final installment, Mark and I discuss King Solomon from the 1 Kings chapter 11 and as well as the story of Samson. Here now is Dr. Mark Laaser and myself as we discuss the God of second chances.
We've talked about the greatest king, David. Today we're going to talk about Solomon, the wisest man, and next we'll talk about Samson, the strongest man. Now, I have to admit to our listeners that when it comes to these king stories in the Old Testament, I get a little lost sometimes in 1 Kings, 2 Kings, 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel. But the story about Solomon that I wanted to reference today for those who want to follow along in their Bibles is from 1 Kings chapter 11. First of all, verses 1 through 6. Are you ready?
I'm royally
Randy?
confused.
You are? I know. I'm telling you. These books about kings and their lineages and their sons and their daughters and all of this kind of stuff, you really have to have a scorecard. But 1 Kings is the story of Solomon, and this is what it says. King Solomon, however, loved many foreign women besides Pharaoh's daughter. So, in other words, he had some politically arranged marriage with Pharaoh's daughter. By the way, we'll talk in a minute about the fact that Solomon is also the author of the Song of Solomon or the Song of Songs, which is generally regarded as, the Bible's great treatise on healthy marriage, healthy romance, healthy sexuality. And there's a lot of speculation in terms of, all of the stuff that he writes about in Song of Solomon. I mean, who was the woman? And there's some speculation that it was Pharaoh's daughter. But now there's a list here of the various foreign women that Solomon loved. There were Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and the Hittites. They're listed here. So Solomon loved many foreign women. The Bible says they were from nations about which the Lord had told the Israelites, you must not intermarry with them because they will surely turn your hearts after their gods. Nevertheless, anytime the word nevertheless appears in the Bible, something bad is going to happen. Solomon held fast to them in love, meaning he had sex with them. The word sex is never used in the Bible, so this means Solomon had sex with all these women. He had 700 wives, and they were of royal birth, and 300 concubines. And his wives led him astray. As Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father had been. He followed Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. I love that, the detestable god. He was not just the wrong God, he's the detestable God. So Solomon did evil in the eyes of the Lord. He did not follow the Lord completely as David, his father, had done. So he needs a second chance, obviously. One of the things that I've always thought about when I remember this passage is that the number of men that we work with here who just think that if they had more sex, if they had more variety of sex, if they could have sex with various women in their imagination, the things would be okay. Well, here's a guy that had 1,000 possibilities on a daily basis. We shouldn't laugh about this, Randy.
Well, we shouldn't, and for all of the Sean Kemps and rock stars in the world who have had sex with thousands of women, your point is still well taken. Here's an extreme case with Solomon, and yet it has nothing to do with the numbers of women. That thirst will never be quenched.
That is right. So we've talked about that any number of times on this show, that sexual thirst is never satisfied. I don't know. I just find it fascinating. He had 700 wives. I mean, that's called being busy, Randy, I think.
That's more than being busy. I have my hands full with the one I currently have had for the past 23 years, and I can't imagine having a second.
She's rather hard to keep up with, isn't she?
She's a busy gal.
She's a very busy gal, particularly when it comes to exterior yard work, as I understand it.
She's a master motivator.
She is a master motivator. Well, okay, so, we can joke about this, but the truth of it is that Solomon had disobeyed God's instructions. Whenever we're talking about second chances, we got to start with understanding that at some point God's commandments, God's instructions, God's truth, is being disobeyed or disregarded.
Yeah, where did they go wrong?
Right, and God had warned Solomon that if he married all these foreign women, they would lead him astray, and they did. So you think about the concept of codependency. In order to satisfy and please these women, he turned his attention to other gods, two of which are mentioned in the passage. I think there are times when we're doing this show when we want to pause for a moment, and I'd just like you to ponder about how many times you've had the thought in your brain that there are other women out there that would be, in fact, satisfying, and how many times have you turned your attention toward the fantasy or the pursuit, even just in your mind, of other women. Given the idea that the grass is always greener, how many of us have even turned our attention to women from other countries or whatever else it is? I mean, we could talk about lots of examples of this. I'm just challenging our average listener to think about how they've pursued 700 wives or 300 concubines in their mind.
Right. And it doesn't take too vivid of an imagination to come up with that very theme, because we're surrounded in our culture with media and, the exposure to these exotic women from around the world does get the imagination of many men just reeling.
Now, one of the things we know about Solomon is that he was, in fact, and he remained, this is the God of the second chance, he remained king. Now, with David, we remember that even after he had committed adultery with Bathsheba, even after he'd had Bathsheba's husband basically murdered, he was allowed to remain king. And our scripture lesson is describing Solomon reminds us that David remained true to the worship of God until his death. With David, we know that God is the God of the second chance, allowed him to remain king. I think we need to remember that God is always willing to give us a second chance. God is always waiting. We talked about the prodigal son, so God is always on the lookout. He's always waiting for us to return back. Now, in our story today, I'll have to be honest with the listeners. I mean, this is not a happy story. I mean, Solomon remains very deluded here for basically the rest of his reign. I mean, God sends various adversaries against him to test him and try him and convince him of God's almighty power and wrath and all of that kind of stuff. And Solomon is really pretty seduced by the neurochemistry of all of this romance.
And at what point does Solomon attempt to start to turn things around and ask our God of second chances for forgiveness?
Did I say he did?
No, and I think that's the part of the story. Something tells me that may be tied to the Paul Harvey catchphrase of the rest of the story.
Well, yeah, basically, at the end of the narrative about Solomon, he never really gets it. So I think when we are suggesting certain characters in the Bible, here that participate in the second chance. So far, we've talked about people that do get it, that do return, that do repent. The prodigal son repents and returns. The woman at the well is the first one to preach the message that Jesus is in fact the Messiah. The adulterous woman, we really don't know what happened to her. She was given a second chance. We assume she hopefully went off and never committed adultery again. David, we know, was faithful to the worship of God the remainder of his reign. Now we come to a story where Solomon never does quite get it. When you think about it, it's kind of interesting, isn't it? Because he is God's wisest man.
Well, that's the part that I was sitting here pondering, because we're all familiar with, the term "the wisdom of Solomon." When someone is a very knowledgeable or wise or experienced person, the reference will be given, the wisdom of Solomon. So where did that all start with this man who was so troubled?
Well, he was wise. I think, and here's an ampersand. We talk about ampersands, or the symbol for and here at Faithful and True all the time. I think sometimes the second chance is about the fact that within the same person there can be good qualities and bad qualities. There can be qualities of disobedience and qualities of wisdom or obedience. So how do we remember Solomon? How do we read Solomon? Well, there are several books of the Old Testament that are influenced by Solomon and his wisdom. There are the stories like we were reading in 1st, 2nd Kings. There is the book of Proverbs. And then there's this one book. When we think about healthy sexuality and we turn to Scripture, we always turn to the book, the Song of Songs, the Song of Solomon. I heard our pastor, Joel Johnson, at Westwood Church preach a sermon series based on the Song of Songs, the Song of Solomon. It's full of romantic attraction, healthy sexuality, lessons about relationship, so that when we remember Solomon, when we remember the giftedness that God created him with, he was a man of untold wisdom. He was generally considered the wisest man that has ever lived. So we give Solomon also a second chance in remembering that this incredibly wise and gifted man and writer was also a man whose talents and giftedness got led astray. So I think it's a lesson for all of us. God is always waiting for us to return. Some of us do and some of us don't. So,
well, was this just a simple case of Solomon not following his own wise advice?
Well, that's what I mean. Solomon can be wise and knowing and a good writer and a good teacher, and he could still have his heart misdirected. So those things can coexist. They don't cancel each other out necessarily. His wisdom and his teaching and his writing can be what they are, even if he himself, at the end of his reign, did not quite return to the true worship of God.
I'm still having a hard time. I'm exhausted thinking of the 1,000 wives.
Yeah, you're thinking of, I know you, Randy, because you're not one of us in terms of this addiction thing. You're thinking about the honeydew list.
That's exactly. You took the words right out of my mouth.
See, some of our listeners are thinking about this in terms of sexual energy, but you're thinking about it in terms of the honeydew list, and that would be exhausting. Well, let's remember, Randy, if it gives you any sense of peace, that Solomon also had many other people to do all of the tasks for him. He very rarely lifted a shovel or did anything like that himself.
Oh, okay. But Solomon had his people. That's good. All
Solomon had many people.
Okay, this is good.
He not only had many wives, he had many people.
Okay.
Now, basically, Solomon accumulated lots of wealth. We could say that he was a man after things of the flesh. He enjoyed fine things. He enjoyed women. He enjoyed money. He enjoyed gold. There are people still looking for Solomon's treasure, Solomon's mines, and all of that kind of stuff. I just want to read part of the end of the story here, 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 41. As for the other events of Solomon's reign, all he did and the wisdom he displayed, and the wisdom he displayed, are they not written in the book of the annals of Solomon? So Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel 40 years. So even though, he's distracted, he's pursuing these other gods, he's allowed to remain king, and he's allowed to write, he's allowed to, pronounce his wisdom. That's the God of the second chance, because God knows that he's gifted Solomon with all of this, and that heritage is still going to be available to all of us today. Then finally, verse 43 said, "Then he rested with his fathers and was buried in the city of David his father, and Rehoboam his son succeeded him as king." There never in the history of Jerusalem and Israel was going to be a king as great as David or Solomon. I mean, it's kind of all downhill from those two guys.
Right.
And one has to wonder whether or not it's part of this sexual and romantic distraction that was part of the downfall there.
And at any point in the scriptures, then, are we enlightened by how God gave Solomon his second chance that he has granted there?
Well, one of the things I think we should remember here is that the Bible teaches us that the sins of the father is passed down to the second, third, and fourth generations. That's in Deuteronomy and so forth. In fact, that's in the Bible 3 or 4 times, that basic truth. Basically, what we see with David, then Solomon, is that the sins of the father are passed down to the second, third, and fourth generations. We're going to see it in some of the other children of David and that kind of thing. I mean, it's a huge problem. What I think we need to take away from this is we have a choice. We have a choice that God is always the God of the second chance. He's always after us. He's always trying to get our attention, and we just have to pay attention. And when we do, the Bible is also quick to tell us that if we return to God's ways, we get it right, that the blessings of that father will be passed down to the 1000th generation. So if we commit sexual sins and we don't do anything about it, we stay distracted, that can be passed down to the second, third, and fourth generation. If we get it right, if we return to God, we allow God to be the God of the second chance, the blessings of that might exist for 1,000 generations. That's a pretty good return on your investment.
That's an incredible return. This is what I'm enjoying so much about this current series on the God of second chances, because for the men who are out there listening to us, and we thank you for your loyalty and for listening to us, and we are hearing from you, and we're hearing the gratitude that's coming our way. Messages like this, in many cases, are taking an anvil off the shoulders of the men who are suffering, wondering if there is that depth of forgiveness in God. Because so many men carrying that shame, carrying that disappointment for their own sexual behavior, they're looking for redemption, they're looking for forgiveness, and they look at themselves in the mirror and say, could God possibly love me? And these messages have just been so inspirational as far as historically giving the details of these characters throughout time and the depths of their sins, and yet God still found it in his heart to forgive.
Right.
I'm eager for us to jump in with both feet and start talking about the man of the hour.
The man of the hour, Samson, which in Hebrew means distinguished, and he was generally regarded, I think most people know Samson as God's strongest man. So just to summarize, we in the Old Testament have looked at God's greatest king, David, and we've looked at Solomon last week, God's wisest man. And today we're going to complete our hat trick of these three guys and go to God's strongest man, Samson. Let's just tell a little bit about the backstory here of Samson. It's a rather fascinating story. It's one of those ones that I was reading an article in Time magazine over in the doctor's office. Hollywood has evidently made a turn back toward Christian messages and stories, and they're even hiring Christian consultants to help them know how to reach out to Christian audiences. So, in the last several months, we've had movies like Noah and Heaven is for Real and what's the other
Son
one?
of God.
The Son of God, The Life of Christ, yet another Life of Christ. So I was just aware that, back in the 50s, back in the days of the advent of Technicolor films, there were some biblical epics that were put on the screen. The Ten Commandments. Samson, I remember, was one of those ones that was done. Our audience can correct us, but I think it was played by Victor Mature. You know, in that movie, we tend to remember the fact that Samson, did all these great feats of strength. But let's just look at this in terms of the biblical history here. Samson lived in a very dark period of the history of Israel. He came after Joshua. Joshua, of course, was the great leader who led them across the River Jordan, defeated all the enemies, retook the land, the walls of Jericho, and all of that. But when the generations that came even immediately after Joshua, who had kind of forgotten the influence of Joshua's leadership, the people of Israel fell into a rather lawless and faithless period of time. The author of the book of Judges summarized these times by declaring, this is Judges 17, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. So they weren't following God's commandments. They were following their own judgments, their own pleasures. It was a lawless and completely sinful time. Does that sound familiar?
Well, it's a dangerous time when you realize that laws are open to your own personal interpretation.
That's right, kind of your own individual ethic. And there would be many, I think, who would say we're pursuing that to a certain extent today. We won't get into current political and sociological speculations, but back then the laws of Moses, the Ten Commandments and so forth, were being ignored. Samson was a product of that age, but like so many Bible stories, he's one of the examples in a lawless time of growing up in a faithful family. The book of Judges tells us in the 13th chapter that his parents were faithful, but that it was also a very difficult time for everyone in that they were being oppressed by the power of the day, which were the Philistines. The Philistines were neighbors to the west primarily, and they were giving them a hard time. And Samson was one of the leaders who became a judge. Judges were kind of like the rulers, they were a combination ruler, prophet, strongman, military force. There were even, female judges, as we know, but Samson was one of those leaders called by God through his great strength to defend the people against the Philistines.
Okay, so you lost me there a little bit in the fact that I'm surprised to hear you say that women were allowed to be judges, and we just talked last week about how powerless women really were back in those days. So it surprises me to hear you say that.
There were women who were allowed to be in that position. A judge was called and anointed by God. So, if they had customs and kind of social norms, but nevertheless, God saw women of faith and strength, and they were allowed to have positions of leadership. Next week, in our 7th episode of this series we're on, we'll talk about how God has even used women of some ill repute to lead some things, and that woman was Tamar, one of the Tamars that appears in the Old Testament.
So at what point is it established, and maybe I'm jumping ahead in the story, but when is it established that Samson's incredible strength was initiated with his hair?
Well, we haven't got to the hair part yet, because
Okay.
that's not revealed until he gets into trouble with Delilah later. But his youth and his growing up years were full of examples of his feats of great strength. This is one of my favorites. With his bare hands, he killed a young lion. I remember that being in the biblical epic back from the 50s.
Okay.
A lion attacks, and he basically strangles the lion.
Who played the part of the lion?
I think that was Bert Lahr, wasn't it? Oh,
That was rather quick. I appreciated that. I didn't...
No, that was in the Wizard of Oz.
Okay.
I think it was an actual lion. Now, how they did it, I don't know. They probably drugged him for the movie. But anyway, he strangles the lion. Another great example is he gathered 300 foxes. This is all in the 15th and 14th chapter of the book of Judges. He took these 300 foxes, tied them together. So can you imagine the strength that would have taken?
That's a full day's work.
Yes, yes. So he sent them through the grain fields of the Philistines, and he lit their tails so that they were torches. So these 300 foxes were scampering through the fields of the Philistines so that they would destroy the crops. On one occasion, he broke the ropes with which the enemy had captured him, bound him. This is Judges 15, verse 14. He broke out of that. He killed 1,000 Philistine soldiers with the jawbone of a donkey. He used that for a weapon. I remember that being in the movie, too. Finally, he carried away the massive gate of Gaza. We talked today about the Gaza Strip, but the mighty massive gate of the city of Gaza, which at that time was the city of the Philistines, when they thought they had him trapped behind the city walls in Judges 16. So, throughout his early life, he's demonstrating that God has bestowed him with great physical strength, and he's using that strength as a judge to defend the people and return the oppression back upon the Philistines. Now, we come to really, I think it's a good example of what we talk around here of being the ampersand, meaning that it's an and here. So he was a great leader in that way. He had, military strength, physical strength. But in spite of that, he was a foolish man. He took, at times, vengeance on those who used devious means to discover the answer to one of his riddles. This is in Judges 14. When deceived by his enemies, his only thought was for revenge, in spite of the Jewish law that says that vengeance was the Lord's, it belonged to him. So he's proving himself as a young man to be kind of, at some levels, full of his own strength, and he used that strength sometimes in terms of the expression of inappropriate anger. Samson, despite all this strength, we've already established that he at times was rebellious. He was kind of foolish. The Bible describes him as foolish. And the point not the point, but part of the point we're getting to is that throughout his life it was marred by weakness for pagan women. So when we pause sometimes and think about how some of these older stories, this is a story that's a couple thousand plus years old, that we have to see the parallels to our modern day culture and modern day events and so forth. Samson was a strong man. He had a weakness and an affinity for pagan women. Now, in those days, that was incredibly important because at some point he insisted on being married to the daughter of one of the Philistines, in spite of his own faithful parents' objection. So again, he was rebellious. But it begins to show you that he has a weakness for women despite any of God's commandments about that. My favorite, personally, because of my own history and some of the history of hundreds of the men that we work with, on one occasion in the 14th chapter of Judges, he was in a house of ill repute. He was in a brothel. He was in a place visiting prostitutes. The Philistines surrounded him, knowing he was in there. So then he escaped out the back. So, a lot of our addicts have stories about close calls, and we have several men right now who were actually arrested for the solicitation of prostitution.
And the Philistines didn't think to cover the back.
Evidently not. And of course, remember, he had all this great strength, and he may have forced his way out, but the Bible simply says he got out the back jack. Wasn't that a song, Randy?
You're thinking of Hit the Road Jack by Ray Charles?
No, I'm thinking about 50 Ways to Leave Your Lover.
Oh, Paul Simon.
Paul Simon. Was that Paul Simon?
Yes. Yep. Get out the back
You
jack.
are a music guru. Okay. Well, anyway, Samson, so we've already established that he's visiting prostitutes, he rebels in marriage, he has an affinity for pagan women, and now finally we get to the part of the story where he falls in love with Delilah, who was a woman from some foreign place that he wasn't supposed to be having conversation with or any kind of relationship with. The Philistines bribed her and got her cooperation to try to figure out. The Philistines have been trying to figure out the secret to his strength, which is, as you mentioned earlier on, had to do with his hair. We struggled today to kind of figure that one out, but his strength was contained somehow in his mighty, lengthy hair. Basically, I've always thought about the story that he must have had some kind of a codependent love addiction also with Delilah, because she was able to ask him certain things or get certain things out of him. He had never revealed this secret to anyone else, and he revealed it to her. So, if that's not some level of codependency or love addiction, I don't know what is. So she cuts his hair off while he's asleep. We all know that story. Now, of course, his strength is gone. So he's committed these ongoing sexual sins, this relationship sin, and that has cost him his hair and his strength as a result of that. So, it's another part of the story where I like to pause and just remind our listeners to think about their own relationship to this kind of story. I'm sure it wasn't, their hair getting cut off, but at what point were they discovered? At what point were they intervened on? At what point did they intervene upon themselves and realize, perhaps through consequences, how their own spiritual, emotional, moral, leadership strength was taken away from them because of these moral sins, this lack of faith in God and God's commandments.
And so once Delilah cut his hair, this is feeding right into the hands of the Philistines. This is just what they were after.
That's right.
And why they had enlisted her help or bribed her or whatever to try and weaken him, to bring him down.
That's right. So they capture him. They'd captured him before, but he'd broken out. We already established that. So they capture him now. This time, but his strength is gone. So they're able to enslave him, get him to do manual labor things, and they also gouge out both of his eyes. So now he's blind. Eventually, he decides to come to his senses, and he realized that God had given him his great strength to serve the Lord and his people. So in other words, in the midst of his degradation, in the midst of his slavery, in the midst of his blindness, he finally comes to his senses. Does that sound familiar?
Yeah.
We started our series here with the prodigal son, and it was after he had gotten in the pig pen. He came. The same term is used. He came to his senses. So Samson comes to his senses, and he prays to God. It's a prayer of repentance. It's a prayer of confession. It's a prayer of humbling himself. And at that point, God gives him back his strength. And we're all familiar with, the climactic final scene of this story where Samson is able to pull down the walls of some great temple or building and kill thousands of Philistines in the process. By the way, there's a lot of God allowing for vengeance in the Old Testament that does allow the killing of a whole lot of people. The God of the second chance here is that Samson's been foolish. He's been rebellious. He's been selfish. He's perhaps been addicted. We can't kind of read into the Bible and make a diagnosis that's 3,000 years old at this point, but he would certainly be an example of certain of the symptoms that we deal with here every day. I just love the part in terms of the God of the second chances that he comes to his senses and he understands, I think, and this is one of the points I wanted to make today, he understands his calling. His calling was to serve and protect the people of Israel. So he came outside of himself. He reclaims or reaffirms his calling. He prays to God. He humbles himself. He confesses. And it's from that broken place that God restores his strength.
Now, I see a direct correlation to the men that we work with here at Faithful and True, because you see a lot of these men who have got a history of being very successful in their careers, in their their reputations for what they do, or their past achievements. And it's kind of like Samson, kind of being this star that's out there, and then they let themselves fall into sexual sin like Samson did. And, sooner or later, this is going to lead to their downfall, just as it led to Samson's downfall.
That's right. And, a lot of the men that come here, they've had a downfall. They've had a weakening. They've had a sense of God taking away their power, their success, their money, their marriage, lots of things. So this story is directly relevant for us today.
Well, and when you start to see them humbled by this experience and asking for the forgiveness, much like Samson got on his knees and asked for God's forgiveness, refocused his life, refocused his energy, refocused his strength. We, in a whole nother way, see men on a daily basis here refocusing their lives in a positive direction. These are the kind of moments of great gratitude where we see these men making a positive change in their life by reaching humility, asking for forgiveness, and calling on that God of second chances.
That's exactly it. And, sometimes we've had a theme verse as part of our program that we've asked the listeners to repeat to themselves. When we were going through the Faithful and True workbook, we would occasionally ask them to repeat the theme verse 3 times or something like that. Like a lot of the Old Testament characters, they occasionally show up in Jesus' teaching or Paul's teaching in the New Testament, and Samson is one of those. And the theme verse for the broadcast today, as far as I'm concerned, is Hebrews, actually. Paul's letter to the Hebrews, the 11th chapter, the 32nd verse. Here's what it says. This is the New English Bible. Out of weakness he was made strong by the power of the Lord. Out of weakness he was made strong by the power of the Lord. So in other words, he had been given great strength, but that strength led him into foolishness, rebellion, idolatry, enslavement, blindness. That's where that strength took him. It was only when he humbled himself, as Hebrews tells us again, that God made him truly spiritually strong.
Thank you for joining us on the Faithful and True podcast today in the third and final installment of the God of Second Chances. We hope that this series has been entertaining and beneficial to you. It's always great to see Dr. Mark Laaser on the screen again as we take you back with this legacy podcast. We hope that you'll visit our website, faithfulandtrue.com, where you'll find many other podcasts such as these, as well as the information about our 3-day intensive workshops. We encourage you to look into the Men's Journey Workshop and consider attending it, as we offer it every month here at Faithful and True. We hope that you will also enjoy the many other resources that are on our website, and will enjoy other podcasts, as well as visit our online bookstore. Until we join you again next week, we hope that this coming week will be a week for you that's filled with many blessings and with great vision.